안녕하세요.
Let me introduce
네.
myself first. I am Jung Eun-young and I am working at Small is Beautiful and I will be emceeing the program today. It's really wonderful to meet you today. Now let us begin the Agriculture Atlas Korean Edition book launch event. In fact, we have been envisioning this event from early this year along with the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung Hong Kong office. And now, after months of preparation, we are finally having the book launch today. So let us now begin our program in earnest. So let us begin with some opening remarks from Im Kyung-un, who is a publisher at The Small is Beautiful and also a biologist. And she'll be sharing some opening remarks with us.
안녕하세요.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Yoon Kyung-un, publisher of Small is Beautiful. This is the 27th year of the founding of Small is Beautiful. Looking back at the past 27 years of our existence, we realize that along the way, every step of the way, we've had many wonderful friends who have been with us in this journey. As we reminisce the past and also look towards the future, we are looking around at the present, the current situation that we are in right now, and we hope to take this opportunity to strengthen these friendships further. Since a few years ago, we have been embarking on an important project with the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, and so this event is another opportunity for us to share this joint work that we have been engaged in with HBS. So far, we have published atlases for coal, plastics, and energy, and today we are having the book launch of the Agriculture Atlas series, which is comprised of 3 different atlases. Agriculture and food is the root of life, but agriculture today is surrounded by many challenges such as environmental pollution and climate change. We hope that the 3 atlas that we will be releasing today will serve as a compass which shows us the direction as we move towards the future. Again, I take this opportunity to express my special appreciation to everyone at HBS for your support in making this project possible. Thanks to the support of HBS, Small is Beautiful was able to raise our voice within the Korean society and contribute to the continuous development of our society overall. I would also like to thank all of the participants who are here for this book launch event. My special thanks goes out to our 4 very special presenters. Last but not least, I'd like to thank all of the editorial staff at Small is Beautiful who have made this book launch possible. Thank you. That was publisher Yoon Kyung-un of Small is Beautiful with her opening remarks. Next, we'd like to invite the director of the Hong Kong office of HBS, Axel Harnight-Zivers, for his opening remarks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Axel Harnight-Zivers and I'm the director of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation office in Hong Kong. I want to welcome all of you to an event that is truly innovative for us, for SIB, and for the entire topic that we are trying to address today. So I'm very excited that we have the opportunity for the first time to actually launch the publications that have been developed together between Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung and Small is Beautiful publishers on a range of environmental issues over the last, I should think, 2 years. Let me say a few words about Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. You may have seen the introductory videos which we showed a few minutes ago, but let me just explain that we are a civic education organization linked to the Greens, to the German Greens, which is a political party in German parliament, and we are affiliated to the German Greens, sharing their outlook, promoting topics which are of interest in the green world around environment, climate politics, but also democracy and human rights. I am heading our office in Hong Kong, which is implementing the Asia Global Dialogue Program, as we call it. And I have the special honor to announce that the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, until the end of this year, is going to establish a new office here in Seoul that is going to become, well, working on Korea, but will also be continuing the Asia Global Dialogue Program in a regional way. So there will be hopefully even more opportunity to work together on important environmental issues and environmental policy issues. We are very much looking forward to this, and I'm very grateful and thank to SIB for this work together over the last years, which has really been exciting and has brought us to this day today, where I now am looking forward to a very interesting discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Axel Knight-Sivers. So during the past 4 years, during COVID, we were not able to meet in person. We've had just online meetings and events, so it's really wonderful to be seeing you face to face today at this event. So I think it's now time for us to begin with our book launch event in earnest. We'll now feature the first presentation by Lena Luig of HBS, and this is a pre-recorded video with Korean subtitles, so we'll be showing you this video. Later on during the Q&A session, Lena Luig will be with us for the discussion.
Hello, my name is Lena Luig, and I am heading the International Agricultural Policy Division at Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Berlin. And I'm really happy to be part of this launch event of the Korean Pesticide Atlas. So in this input, I would briefly like to draw attention to Heinrich-Böll Foundation activities on pesticides in the different regions, different countries. But I would mainly focus on setting this Korean pesticide atlas in the context of, on the one hand, EU pesticide policies and also international pesticide policies. So starting, as I said, with saying a few sentences on HBF's work on pesticide. The first pesticide atlas, the German edition, was launched in January 2022, last year. Also, it was also the year of the 60th anniversary of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. And the German Pesticide Atlas was launched together with the Pesticide Action Network Germany and Friends of the Earth Germany. And it was really successful in terms of media coverage. And obviously, on the other hand, the large German pesticide producers, Bayer and BASF, were not amused. And then came the first international version, or the first English version of the Pesticide Atlas, launched by our Brussels office in October. Also a really successful launch. But what is even greater is that afterwards, so many different Heinrich-Böll Foundation offices started to adapt this Pesticide Atlas and make their own editions, just as the Hong Kong office did for this Korean Pesticide Atlas. So there's already a Kenyan edition of the Pesticide Atlas, an Italian edition, a Nigerian edition, a US edition, a Spanish edition, and there's so many more to come, as I listed here, from very different countries and very different languages also. And maybe just to name two really interesting examples of impacts of this pesticide work of the different offices. I would name Kenya and Nigeria, because in both countries, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, together with the partners in the countries, was successful in pushing the government, pushing parliament to revise the registration of some really hazardous pesticides that are banned in the EU, but that are still registered and being used in both countries. So I think this is really an interesting example of how the activities around the different pesticide atlas editions can really have a political impact. And same applies to Germany, but I will explain that later. So talking about EU pesticide policies first, I don't know if you have heard of the Farm to Fork strategy of the European Commission. It is a strategy, it says on the top right, for a fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly food system. And it is part of the European Green Deal that was proposed, that was presented by the European Commission in 2020. So one of the main goals, of the main aims of the Farm to Fork strategy is actually a 50% reduction in pesticide use, so the volume of pesticides being used, but also a 50% reduction in pesticide toxicity, meaning that less toxic pesticides are supposed to be used in the future. The implementation of this reduction goal, reduction target, is supposed to happen through the sustainable use of pesticides regulation. There was already a sustainable use of pesticides directive, at EU level. And the main goal of this directive was to implement the integrated pest management, the system of integrated pest management that aims to use chemical pesticides only at the last resort. But the sustainable use of pesticides directive was not successful in achieving this aim. So now the sustainable use of pesticides regulation is a new attempt to really implement integrated pest management at EU level. The first draft of this regulation was presented last year, 2022. The presentation was already delayed due to the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. And even after the launch of this first draft, the pesticide industry, pesticide lobby kept putting a lot of pressure on the European Commission with the argument that now that there's a war in Ukraine, food security is in danger, food security in the EU, but also globally, because this is the narrative of the industry, now that exports from Ukraine, for example, grain exports, are limited. We as the EU need to produce more in order to feed the world, which of course is debatable because hunger and food insecurity is not mainly due to a problem of supply, but rather of high prices and poverty when it comes to the people who want to buy food. So the industry was successful in demanding a second impact assessment, an economic impact assessment, and this is why this whole process is delayed at the moment, but we're still expecting a second version of the sustainable use of pesticide regulation before summer break this year. Another topic at EU level when it comes to pesticide policies at EU level is the chemical strategy, because the Commission is supposed to publish a proposal specifically on an export ban for certain hazardous chemicals, also pesticides, until the end of this year. So this export ban is supposed to put an end to double standards, meaning that European pesticide companies or other chemical companies are exporting pesticides that are banned in the EU due to health hazards or also environmental hazards and risks. The problem is with all these EU policies that there will be European Parliament elections next year in May in 2024. So I really hope that it will still be possible to bring both the sustainable use of pesticides regulation as well as the EU-wide export ban through Parliament until these elections. But this is at risk. A last point on EU pesticide policies is that the approval of glyphosate is debated again because the approval of the substance glyphosate actually ended by the end of last year. And because the authority that is responsible, the European Food Safety Authority, was not able to revise all studies again, the approval was renewed for another year. So now it is valid until the end of this year. But the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, is supposed to present its evaluation now in July. So we're waiting for this evaluation to see whether we will be the European Union will be able finally to also ban glyphosate for its really hazardous impacts on human health, especially, but also on biodiversity. Another topic, this is why I said in Germany we were also successful, or we also had a political impact with our pesticide atlas. This other topic is national export bans. So France was the first country in the European Union that implemented an export ban for certain hazardous pesticides in 2022. And since 2020, different German organizations have been pushing for a national export ban as well that prohibits the export of certain hazardous pesticides that are banned in the EU. So also with the aim of putting an end to these double standards in pesticide trade. We always framed this French export ban as a best practice and something the German government should draw ideas from, but there's a flaw in the French export ban because it only regulates the export of finished pesticide products and not pesticide active ingredients that can then be formulated in other countries. So, for example, from Germany, quite a lot of active substances are being exported to countries like Brazil and South Africa. And in these countries, the pesticides are formulated. So afterwards, these countries can sell the finished pesticide products also to other countries in the region. So, for example, there's a lot of pesticide products coming from South Africa to Kenya, but the active ingredients in parts come from Europe. So at the moment, the German Ministry for Agriculture is also working on an export ban, and Heinrich-Böll Foundation is doing its best to trying to influence in a good way, because the risk is the same, that only pesticide products will be regulated through a national ban, export ban, and not active ingredients. And there are similar plans for national export bans in Belgium, by the way. I just want to say very few sentences on why Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Germany is focusing so much on this double standards issue. It is because the sales of highly hazardous pesticides are really profitable for the large pesticide producing companies like the German companies Bayer and BASF. So Bayer is making around a third of its profits from the sales of highly hazardous pesticides, and BASF around a fourth. of its profits from selling highly hazardous pesticides. And the problem is that the largest part of these highly hazardous pesticides are being sold in countries of the global south and are being used in countries of the global south and not in Europe or Northern America. And this ends up in the problem that the largest part of unintended pesticide poisonings are happening outside Europe and North America. So this is why we are putting such an emphasis on ending the double standards in global pesticide trade. I would like to end now with just a few words on international pesticide policies that are relevant at the moment. So I have to be transparent here. I'm recording this input before the actual launch of the Korean Pesticide Atlas. So in May, the conference of the parties meeting of the Basel, Stockholm, and Rotterdam conventions is still about to happen. And I don't know the results yet. So these are the conventions on toxic residues, on persistent organic pollutants, and on pesticide trade and the prior informed consent when it comes to importing hazardous pesticides. And what is really interesting is that paraquat, as a really highly hazardous herbicide, even more hazardous than glyphosate, is about to be listed in the annex of the Rotterdam Convention, so that all importing countries would have to agree to the import of this highly hazardous substance. So I'm really curious to hear if the different countries will be successful in listing paraquat in the annex. Another really interesting initiative of Brazilian scientists is an international pesticide standard alliance. So the goal of this initiative, of this alliance, is to really align national registration policies so that in the end, certain highly hazardous pesticides will not be able to be registered in any country of the world, also in order to put an end to these double standards. And probably you're also aware of the work of the Pesticide Action Network and International Pesticide Action Network, and they have been doing really great work in order to achieve the aim of a global phase out of all highly hazardous pesticides, HHP. So the Pesticide Action Network always updates a list of these highly hazardous pesticides, naming different criteria or based on FAO and WHO criteria. And at the moment, this list covers 338 different pesticide substances. So the aim of the Pesticide Action Network is to phase out of all these highly hazardous substances. This is my input for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm really happy to listen to the rest of this launch event, and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Lena, for your presentation, although she is not here in person, but we will meet her during the Q&A session. Next, let us go on to the Korean presentations. Small is Beautiful continued to edit the pesticide atlas, and we were quite shocked by the facts that we had to face. First, our ignorance on pesticides, and the fact that there are not that many researchers that research pesticides with the perspective that is similar to Small is Beautiful. But in this process, we were able to meet the presenters today who have been invited because we have similar perspectives. It is an honor and privilege to invite you to the stage as presenters. The first presenter for the Korean side is Professor Kim Eun-jin. She has been continuing her movement against genetically modified organisms in Korea, and she has also had a movement for healthy food. And so Professor Kim Eun-jin has been working on this issue for a very long time at the private sector. And I believe that the activities by Professor Kim has enabled all of us to come to where we are today. Let us invite Professor Kim with a big round of applause.
안녕하세요.
I listened to the previous presentation. What came to mind is that I was asked to talk about pesticide policies, but I think I should have presented concerning pesticide substances or pesticide itself, because the first presentation focused on that. Well, today I have been asked to discuss Korea's policies for pesticides. What are the policies now and what are the policies in the past? Here you can see an article from 2019. So this is an article from the Nongmin Daily, which is a daily for farmers. But not only in this daily, but many other papers actually wrote about this content. For example, it says that the self-sufficiency for crops is amongst the lowest in the world, but the amount of pesticides used in Korea is one of the top 10 in the world. And so when I actually read this article, I thought about, do we really use so much pesticides? When I meet farmers, I don't really feel like that is the reality. So when we measure the amount of pesticide used, what is the standard? I looked at various materials, and it's always based on the amount sold by the pesticide companies. And so all of the statistics are based on the amount of sales of pesticide companies. And here you can see a part that was written by the Korea Crop Protection Association. But the Korea Crop Protection Agency is an agency that is pro-pesticides. It says crop protection, so you may think that it's protecting crops, but it's actually focused on using pesticides. And so their content says that when there are statistics on the use of pesticides, it's not just about chemical pesticides, but it also includes biological agents. And because of this, it does not take into consideration the main crops that are farmed in each country. So that's what this says on the slide. So for the US, they have large farmland, and so it uses more land for farming, which means that different crops are available, which will translate into differences of use in pesticides. For example, in the US, is this the pointer? I don't think it's working. Well, maybe it's just me. So here it says, in the US, they're focused on barley. For barley, when we farm barley 2 times a year, it's farmed usually during the winter, which means because it's farmed during the winter, it's less affected by pests and also other grass. And so it actually is very different from the rice, for example, that we cultivate in Korea. And so the amount of pesticides that is used, it should not be based on the total amount of pesticides that is sold. And so having read this, then I looked at these statistics, and it's something that I could really comprehend. So from 1970, we have a record of the total amount of pesticides that are used, and also the amount per hectare for agricultural chemicals and chemical fertilizers. You can see that the unit is 1,000 tons. So here is 3.7, which means 3,700 tons. And that actually is 1.6 for every hectare. But if you go to 2021, what you need to focus on is the 1990s first. Here you can see that the unit for per hectare goes beyond 10. So it's 10.4, 11.7. It actually goes up to 13 or so, and then it goes back down to 12 point something. And these statistics are announced by the Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Affairs. And there is actually a footnote. It says that chemical fertilizers is based on the amount used just for agriculture, but it does not have that same footnote for pesticides. But so this means that the pesticide marked here could also be pesticides used outside of agriculture. For example, from the 1990s, we started to build a lot of golf clubs, and grass is grown on the golf clubs. And the herbicides used on golf clubs is very immense compared to other farmland. And I took a look at the number of golf clubs in Korea. In 1991, we had 63 golf clubs in Korea. That actually grew to 150 to 160 in 2000. And in 2020, we have 534. And in 2021, we have 810 golf clubs in Korea. So we see an immense increase in the number of golf clubs, which means that the amount of pesticide used will also spike. And that actually will lead to a spike in the use of agrochemicals in Korea. So let's take a look at the history of pesticide use in Korea. In 1906, this was just before the Japanese colonization period, and when we had what we call the agricultural experimental organizations, and they experimented with pesticides. Before Japan colonized Korea, they actually experimented with agricultural chemicals in Korea so that they could actually sell pesticides once they colonized Korea. So that's how it started. And in 1930, we established a company called Chosun Samgong, and that's when we first introduced synthetic agrochemicals in Korea. And so in the previous presentation, you talked about how the raw materials are used to produce different pesticides in different countries. In 1930, that was when we first did that in Korea. And up until 1950, anyone could establish a pesticide company and make their own pesticides. So in 1957, there were 13 companies. And when this number grew to 13, we started to have a need for the management and control of these companies. And that's why we enacted the Pesticide Control Act in 1957. And in 1969, we actually produced parathion for the first time in Korea. And in the 1970s, we have an immense increase in the use of pesticides. And so, in 1957, the Pesticide Control Act was enacted. And let's take a look at the meaning of this law. So, from the 1950s to the 70s, what was our perspective of pesticides? When we first enacted this law, this was intended to rule out any defective pesticides. But the word defective means that if anything is defective and we talk about something being defective, then it means that we're trying to industrialize this sector when we talk about something being defective in a certain sector. So when we talk about junk food, everyone started to talk about how we have to get rid of junk food, and that actually led to the commercialization and industrialization of snacks when we started to use the word junk food. And so everyone now thinks that all of the snacks that are produced by conglomerates are the only snacks that are not junk food. And so that's the perspective that Korea had in talking about junk pesticides. And so what they do is they introduce a licensing system. So all of the pesticides that were used in the private sector and distributed privately all become illegal because we establish a licensing system. So, for example, all of the farming methods that were used traditionally to get rid of pests or weeds, all of the natural materials that were used traditionally all had to be licensed or they would be dubbed illegal. And so what happens with the Pesticide Control Act is that it's not fundamentally to alleviate the harm of pesticides, but it actually was resulted in establishing large pesticide companies in Korea, and it also meant that we're trying to produce pesticides in Korea rather than import. And a lot of the smaller companies, the micro companies, all closed down. And so in the mid-1970s, we only have 10 pesticide companies left. So this Pesticide Control Act translated in creating large companies in this sector with the industrialization of this sector, and that led to changes in the pesticide market in Korea. And in the 80s, our perspective of pesticides starts to change. In 1962, we launched the first 5-year economic development plan, and that is when we start to have people move to urban areas out of the farms so that they can work in factories. And the empty space left by the people who leave for the cities are then filled in by machines, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers. And in 1981, the Pesticide Control Act is revised, and all of the tests related to pesticides that were done by the government in the past is now deregulated so that tests can be done by the pesticide companies themselves. And that actually led to an increased awareness about pesticides in the late 1980s. Of course, there was awareness about pesticides, but it was mostly focused on agrochemical poisoning. But from the 1980s, we started to become very interested in pesticide residues. This is because in 1987, U.S. agricultural goods started to be imported into Korea due to pressures by the U.S., and in the media, we started to think about pesticide residues in imported agricultural goods and fruits. And that is why in 1988, we introduced standards for pesticide residues. And so with the heightened awareness from the 1990s, we start to have new policies concerning pesticides. There was the Leo Declaration in 1992. The word sustainability actually is a word that was coined during the Rio Declaration. We never used the word sustainability before that. And so there was heightened awareness about sustainability and ecosystem and environment with the Rio Declaration. And there was a paradigm shift towards sustainability with the 1992 Rio Declaration. And so alongside with this flow, there was also a parallel flow within the WTO because the WTO was launched, changing the global market. With the launch of the WTO, during the Uruguay round, that was in preparation for WTO, they talked about opening all markets, but they failed to do that. But what they did was to open the agricultural market. They were not able to open the intellectual property market, but they actually include that in the annex, and that's called TRIPS, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. This means that everything that is imported and exported could be monopolized, including seeds. In the past, monopolization was only for manufactured goods, but due to the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS, the monopolization could be expanded to everything, including seeds and plants. And so in 1995, we revised the Pesticide Control Act once again in line with TRIPS. And because of this revision, we move in the direction of protecting the intellectual property rights of pesticide companies, which means that their intellectual properties are protected for monopolization. And so all of the manufacturing of pesticides can now only be done by the handful of pesticide companies that existed at that time. At that time, we talked about how we need to increase food security through production of agricultural goods in Korea. And that actually tried to justify the use of pesticides in Korea, as we have already discussed through previous presentations. And so, at that time, there was a justification of the utilization of pesticides for food security. And now we step into the 2000s. So these policies since the 1990s continued to 2017, and there was an immense incident in 2017, the so-called pesticide egg incident. This actually started in Europe. Well, when piperonium was detected in Europe, we actually tested all agricultural products, and we found that DDT was detected in the agricultural products of environment-friendly farms. DDT was banned internationally from 1970 and in Korea from 1979, and that is why we moved to the positive list system, or PLS, in 2019. So PLS, well, we talked about the pesticide residue standards that was established in 1988, and so any of the pesticides that are belonging to the pesticide residue standard can have a certain standard for residues, but if you are not on this positive list, then you have to have 0 milligram per kilogram as your residue. So all of the pesticides that are not included in the positive list system could no longer be used, and that actually led to a lot of issues. For example, this is a system that actually eliminates the use of unregistered pesticides, not the use of all pesticides. And this does not regulate pesticide companies that produce the pesticides, but it actually regulates the farmers that use the pesticides. And so, once we established the positive list system, there were no real changes in the use of pesticides in Korea. And so, the revision of the Pesticide Control Act is not for the ecosystem, the health of the people, and the environment, but rather it actually translated into benefiting the pesticide companies in Korea. So let's take a look at what are some of the alternatives. So during the last 70 years, we have this policy trend. Do we have any alternatives? I do believe that alternatives are certainly available. If there were no alternatives, then I don't think people around the world, including Europe, would make any efforts. We do have alternatives. In 1997, the Act on the Promotion of Environment-Friendly Agriculture and Fisheries and the Management of and Support for Organic Foods was established, and I believe that this law will be discussed by the next presenter. So this act was enacted in 1997, and we do see that the amount of pesticide used in farms is decreasing due to the increased awareness amongst the people and also many babies that are born with different diseases. And so because of heightened awareness, in 1997, the Act on the Promotion of Environment-Friendly Agriculture and Fisheries and the Management of and Support for Organic Foods is enacted. That actually leads to more eco-friendly farming in Korea. And as a result, it did have positive results, but at the same time, the agricultural chemical companies, the pesticide companies, they actually acquire seed companies. We have BIL and BASF, and they are a seed company around the world. And at the same time, we see that they continue to promote GMO, saying that if we have GMO, we will use less pesticides. And so what we see is that pesticide companies and seed companies join hands to create this massive multinational company. And that is the reality that we have here in 2023. But are there any alternatives on our side? I do believe so. If we take a look at the pesticide atlas, we are faced with climate crisis, food crisis. But in Korea, when we talk about climate crisis, we always talk about food crisis together. But when we connect these two issues, we always think about how the agricultural sector should respond to climate crisis. But I believe that that is an incorrect approach. We need to think about what our position should be for agriculture in this era of climate crisis. Because food crisis is directly linked to the livelihood of everyone. And so, we need to approach this from the right to live. And so how are we going to secure safe food for everyone? And at the same time, how are we going to make our environment and ecosystem sustainable? It should not be about making people feel guilty about eating meat, making people feel guilty about not being a vegetarian. If we focus on only what comes on our table, it will have limitations. So what is our alternative? We still have seeds that have been passed down from our ancestors. They are the traditional seeds and the traditional varieties. And we still have natural and inorganic matters that we have used in our tradition since our ancestors. And we also have farmers that wish to continue these traditions. And so I believe that in the future, we need to focus on these varieties, these organic and natural matters, and these farmers. They need to go hand in hand, supported by the people and policies. And if we go in that direction, I do believe that we can produce safe and healthy food for all without using pesticides. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kim, for your passionate presentation.
Before we go on to the third presentation, I was wondering how I should introduce our third speaker. So we're talking about pesticides and the different alternatives to pesticides. So in Korea, there are people who engage in eco-friendly or environmentally friendly agriculture for the past 30 years. Well, in fact, from 1960, so much longer than that. We do have farmers in eco-friendly agriculture and many activists in the field as well. And so they've formed different associations and organizations, including the Eco-Friendly Agriculture Self-Help Fund Committee. And so we have Director General Choi Dong-gun of this committee who will be giving the next presentation. It's an honor to welcome here.
예, 반갑습니다.
And now I'd like to begin my presentation. So as you can see, the contents of my presentation is quite long. What is eco-agriculture or ecologically friendly agriculture? So this is the definition. Professor Kim talked about the environmental agriculture promotion movement that exists in Korea, but I think that definition changed a little bit. So it's, as you can see here, promoting biological diversity and promoting the biological circulation of the land and to maintain the health of the agricultural ecosystem. These are the goals of eco-agriculture. And so reducing the use of antimicrobials and other pesticides and chemicals in order to ensure the health of agriculture. Synthetic pesticides, chemical fertilizers are not used or their uses are reduced for eco-agriculture. So eco-agriculture or ecologically friendly agricultural products means healthy produce. So it's the same for the activists and the farmers, but what the message we gave to the consumers was that eco-friendly produce is safe produce. And so many people had the understanding that eco-agricultural produce has to be zero pesticide. In fact, that's the message that we try to deliver. So what happens when there is a detection of pesticide in these produce? So this framework, the overall frame of safety tended to be problematic. And so we came up with this new definition in 2018 through a law revision. So in 1997, that was when the law was first enacted. And since then, we've seen the evolution of the definition of eco-agriculture over the years. So I think that shows the current state that ecologically friendly agriculture in Korea is in right now. So Professor Kim called this eco-friendly agriculture, but previously we called it environmental conservation agriculture. So there were so many terminologies that were utilized. And so we decided to use the word sustainable agriculture in English. So sustainable agriculture or environmental conservation-based agriculture. But then after the change of government, we changed terminology once again. So environmentally friendly agriculture is the new term. So, I mean, this change in the definition has led to a lot of changes in or misconceptions. So we have changed the official name or terminology to environmentally friendly. So this act was enacted in 1997, and in 2001 we changed the title of the act to sustainable, and now it's changed once again to environmental friendly agricultural products. But anyhow, it's a private sector that led in this eco-agriculture movement in Korea, and in 1994 the government had established a department in charge of this eco-agriculture. And so we have this systematized eco-agriculture in Korea. And so we may miss all of the efforts that our predecessors had put in place to develop this industry as a result. So these were people who began the cooperative or collective agricultural practices. So at that time, we didn't call it eco-friendly, but anyhow, these were groups of farmers who came together who adopted a different way of producing agricultural produce. And in the 1970s, there was an organization that was formed that first began organic farming. And so this community first began as a family business. And in Hwasong, we had the Sanan town, which first began the Yamagishi movement. And so the focus of their farming was not to have mass production, but to introduce alternative ways of cultivation. And the Catholic Farmers Organization was another example, which worked to promote these eco-friendly farming methodologies. So, in fact, back from the 1970s, the private sector had led this effort to have eco-friendly or organic farming practices in the country. And at that time, there were consumer groups that were formed to ensure sustainability of this new type of farming, and those would be the cooperatives. So now, well, the catchphrase was that the producers would protect the life of the consumers, and the consumers would protect the livelihood of the producers. That was a catchphrase that they used that time. So how are we going to ensure that these safe produces would be sold to the right consumers? So again, that is the background, the history. This is the consumers' community organization. And there's also Hansalim and the Ture Co-op and iCoop, which began in 1998. And we have also the Together community, consumer community organizations that was formed more recently. So all of these different organizations came together, and we eventually formed the Korea Eco-Friendly Agriculture Board because we understood the need for these different groups to form alliances and put our efforts together. So it is these people who came together, and they tried to ensure eco-friendly agriculture would become more sustainable. And so there was an act for supporting the sustainable agriculture practices And these organizations came together in order to ensure that this law will be enacted. So those were some of the activities. And we have the Organic Agriculture Day that was enacted. And it was these organizations that allowed the designation of this day. As for the government policies and institutions to support eco-friendly agriculture, we have in 1986 the Uruguay round negotiations which began, and since then we were to open our agricultural market, and so the farmers were asking for protection, and the eco-friendly agriculture promotion policies began to be formulated to support the farmers. There were some organic farmers, also some non-pesticide farmers. And so we had to begin with a redefinition of this kind of farming. So that's the first work that we did. And since then, we agreed also on having a quality assurance or quality certification system. In 1994, the government established the Environmental Agricultural Division, and that division was in charge of all of the certification work. When we were enacting this law, or trying to legislate, the Ministry of Environment was actually opposed because the ministry said we have a Basic Act on Environmental Protection. So why is it that the Ministry of Agriculture is stepping in to establish a separate law that is very similar? So there was some clash between the government ministries. So anyhow, that's just a side note. And again, the farmers were following a self-labeling system, but then in the 1990s, the government came up with a formal labeling system. And so now we have a unified system in place which weakened the link between the producers and the consumers of agricultural produce. So what we began with was that, as I mentioned earlier, the pesticides and the fertilizers, to not use them, or to rather than not use these pesticides, or to rather than adopt organic farming practices. I mean, there was this confluence of different definitions. So we had the general farming concept, and so there were some adjustments made into the Act in 2006 to redefine what it means to be eco-friendly in terms of the produce. And so as you can see here, we began in 1992, and the concept of pesticides has changed over the years. So we began with, it's an agriculture. Eco-friendly agriculture is an agriculture which does not use chemical fertilizers or pesticides. But then the definition continued to change over the years. And so there was a time when we included low pesticide also as part of eco-friendly agriculture. And if you look at the overall framework, again, the definition really focuses on whether pesticide was used or not, whether it was used in a huge amounts or in small amounts. So it's not a concept of giving life to earth or protecting the environment. The focus, again, is on whether pesticide has been used or not in our definition of eco-friendly agriculture. So that is how our environmentally friendly agriculture is right now in Korea. In the number of households engaged in eco-friendly farming reached 198,000 in its peak. But then since 2009, the peak year, we see a continuous decline. And right now, the total area, the area of eco-friendly farms in the total farmland is only at 4.9%, which is quite low, or excuse me, 4.5%. So again, the system itself is very problematic. It's continued to be strengthened to the disadvantage of the farmers. So this is our certification system for eco-friendly produce. So what is certification? When you visit hotels, for example, you will see different numbers of stars, 4-star hotel, 5-star hotel. So you have to meet that criteria to receive a certain number of stars. Similarly, it's for eco-friendly produce also. You have to go through all of this process for certification. And Han Salim will be presenting a participatory certification system later on, but we do also have examples of third-party certification in which the regular citizens would participate in the country. So this is a process by which the farms would apply for certification. And you have to go through all of the document submission and the inspection and review. So for example, they look or inspect the soil and the water use. And if there are banned substances that is identified or detected, then the certificate issuance may be canceled. So even if you did not use the pesticides, but because of non-point pollution or other causes, your produce become polluted or there is pesticide detected, your certificate would be canceled. So we've seen cases up to the recent times. It's not the fault of the farmers, but still the farmers are held accountable for this detection of pesticide. And so the current certification system, as you can see, is quite problematic, particularly for the farmers, because it brings so much disadvantage and complaints on their part. So I'm showing you the number of certificate cancellations. About over 2,000 farms have been canceled. I would say about 3% of all of the farms, their certification is being canceled. So again, in some cases, 30% out of this 3% would be cases in which the farmers had actually used the pesticide. So only 30% out of the total 100%. So you will see 3.9% is that our latest figure. But there are cases when the certification application process, the farmers would just quit that process. So those who have quit their numbers are not included. So in 2020, 2021, about 1,900 farms had given up the certification process altogether. So you see different types of or ways of cultivation, but it says in the law that synthetic pesticides should not be detected. So previously, if the detected amount is less than 1/10 of the MRL set by the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety, you can still get the certification for eco-friendly produce. But that article has been cancelled, has changed, and so detection itself is cause for cancellation. In the case of Korea, we have a full inspection for all of these eco-friendly produce, and there are actually several rounds of full inspection that takes place. In the case of US, for example, only about 5% of the produce are inspected. So there's just sample inspection. And for example, if they find out that the detection is more than 1/20 of the MRL of EPA, then they would go on with further inspections. For many other countries, they don't even have any residual pesticide criteria to begin with. And so because of all of these irrational stipulations in the law, so many of the Korean farmers, eco-friendly farmers, are being disadvantaged, and that they have a lot of complaints. So this shows you the different attitudes by the scholars on the pesticide residue. And they say that, many of them say that it's not, or we cannot avoid this 100%. So even if the farmers themselves did not use the pesticide directly, there are cases of detection because these would fly in from the neighboring farms. There's also a result of airborne pest control. And many of the farmers also say that we do need to use some amount of pesticide. About 60% of them said it is necessary, and it's very expensive. About 60% of the farmers say that it is still important to have the residue pesticide testing take place on a regular basis. And if you look at the consumer perception on eco-friendly produce certification, Korea has one of the highest perception levels among the consumers. But if you look at the different types, all they are given the same type of mark. I talked about the definition revision earlier, and we had conducted a survey of about 500 consumers on the revising the definition of eco-friendly produce, and the majority of those surveyed say that we do need redefinition. So, what should we do in order to address these challenges in the existing certification system? So, in fact, that is what we are pondering over right now. Since we are dealing with the issue of certification, in fact, many of these farms are using a lot of different agricultural materials rather than pesticides. And these materials are simply bought in the commercial market. So the farmers are having to buy eco-friendly agricultural materials at a high cost from the market. And within the concept of organic livestock, we only have about 100 livestock farms. And so we need to link up the agricultural and livestock farms to do eco-friendly farming well, but we still have a long way to go for this network to be established and to be effective. So we really need to begin with the understanding that what we are doing, in fact, is to protect the environment overall. For the consumers also, they need to look into the understanding that they have. And the government also should change their focus in providing support to these eco-friendly farms. And so all stakeholders have different roles to play in order to improve the existing system. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Director General Choi Dong-gun, for your presentation.
Let us go on to the last presentation of the day. Well, when we were looking for the last presenter, it took us quite a long time because we were not really sure on what we should talk about as our last presentation. And as we were editing Pesticide Atlas, well, it does talk about HH HHD, and so in the last HHP, and the last chapter talks about pesticide-free regions. So it talks about case studies of areas that are pesticide-free, and so that's the last chapter of the pesticide atlas. And so the last presenter today is from Hansallim, and currently he is in charge of quality control at Hansallim Cooperative. So let us invite Mr. Lee Sung-gyu. Please welcome him to the stage.
네, 반갑습니다.
So my title today is The Efforts by Hansallim. It's one example of creating healthy food that is pesticide-free. And so thank you very much for including us. And it is a privilege for me to present on behalf of Hansallim. Let me first introduce Hansallim to you. Hansallim was established in 1986 as a small store selling rice. We believe that we need to work with environmental friendly farmers that do not use pesticides and chemical fertilizers. And these were farmers that voluntarily worked for the recovery of the environment. And so what we wanted to do is to connect these farmers with consumers. Hansallim is created of different parts. Han means one or all together, and sallim means to let live. And so all life is one, and through the Hansallim movement, we wish to make sure that the table comes alive. And in order to do that, we need to revive agriculture and also to revive life on earth. So that is the vision of Hansallim. So this is where we began. This is the picture of our rice store. Currently, there are 844,000 household members, and we have a sales of about 490 billion Korean won. So about 1,500 products or items are circulated and distributed through our offline and online stores. So we started as a small rice store, but we have grown quite significantly. So we are invited as a case study, and that is a great joy for us. Within Hansallim, we have more members and we have grown a lot, and that leads to challenges. And there are difficulties in finding solutions for these challenges. But rather than talking about these challenges, I would like to talk about how Hansallim grew. What are some of the upsides of Hansallim that propelled our growth? Having said that, I will not say that we are not without our challenges, but I would like to focus on this presentation on how we were able to grow, what propelled our growth, and what led to the growth of our membership. So that will be the focus of my presentation today. I have 6 points that I would like to make concerning this. Last week, there was an organization for international certification that said that the green farmers, they are the warriors at the forefront trying to farm without pesticides. And so it is very difficult to farm without pesticides. But these are the warriors that are fighting on their farms. And the certification organizations, the auditors, they said that visiting these warriors is what they do for a living. And so what Hansallim does is to try and support these warriors so that they can continue to be encouraged to fight on their farms. So that's the focus of our activities. And so the 6 points that I would like to make today is focused on that type of support. First, we are a cooperative in our structure. I work with the 한살림 Business Cooperative. So we have the large organization that is a cooperative. And so within that organization, my organization is in charge of the business side. So we are a cooperative, which means that the members who are like-minded come together to make decisions together and think together. We have an independent standard. Well, of course, we comply by government standards, but we also have our independent standards. Some are more stringent than the government standards. So these are the standards that we have for our cooperative, and all of the standards that we have are standards that are decided with the consumers and with the producers. And 한살림 puts an importance on making decisions together. So everything that we decide, whether it be standards, whether it be the operation side, we make those decisions together. And so we have assemblies, board meetings, committees, and we also have smaller meetings so that we can make these decisions together, not only concerning the basic direction of our cooperative, but even the pricing is decided in this way, how we're going to distribute products, how we're going to operate, and if there are issues with the producers, what will be the disciplinary action, all of that is decided together. In order to raise our voices, sometimes we have protests, and we also have visits to the production sites. And we also have a harvest festival every year. The second characteristic is our contract system. So every year, we contract the amount that will be produced per year. So for the producers, they are sure about the income that they will receive through 한살림 for that year. And the producers already know how much they need to produce, what kind of a price they will receive, and what kind of standards they will need to follow, and that is included in a contract. From the consumer side, because the amount and prices are already decided, the consumers can then consume based on these standards. Symbolically, if there is a lot of inventory that is left over, then we also think about how we're going to consume the leftover inventory. At times, we will have a 30% increase or decrease in prices as needed, but because of these contracts, the farmers are able to estimate what they will need to do that year and also what they will earn that year. And we also have our production community. In the beginning, the consumers also belong to these production communities, but taking reality into consideration, only the producers are included in this community. So each community is created of at least 5 producers, and you have to belong to a community in order to have a contract with 한살림. We mandate communities because we believe that by having a community, you can have regular meetings, you can benchmark each other's farming methods, we can help each other, and we can encourage each other and support each other. And that's why we mandate the creation of these communities. 한살림, from the very early days, as you have seen in the previous presentations, was focused on the relationships between people. And so in farming, the relationship with the farmers, the local community, the environment, the distribution system was all within our vision. And so we have these communities so that they can work through these visions. We also have on-site visits, and we sometimes have opportunities to have meetings like this. Or sometimes we would talk over a drink, and you can see that they are actually studying about a certain topic together over a drink. And so we always look forward to these communities coming together for discussions and for learning. Well, in Korea, because of the farms that we have in Korea, sometimes there are items that inevitably use pesticides. So in order to have sustainable production, sometimes pesticides are inevitable for certain products, such as fruits. And so without pesticides, you're not able to harvest an appropriate amount of fruits. And so for some items, we do allow pesticides, but we have standards for this. And when we do use pesticides, we have very thorough management of pesticides. So how can we minimize the use? How can we make sure that there's no misuse of pesticides? We have all of our standards in place. And you can see that for items, we have a total number of pesticide sprays that you can use. For example, for apples, you can only spray 7 times. For pears, only 6 times a year. And then we also have limitations per chemical. And we always allow only half of what the government allows. And we also have a period of using pesticides and harvesting. And we usually make sure that that period is twice the amount of what is mandated by the state. And we also look at international papers for herbicides and for any growth boosters. We don't use them at all. And we don't use any HHP. And even for the pesticides that are commonly used, we always take into consideration international standards to consider the impact on the environment and also bees. We are very interested in bees these days, as are many other organizations around the world. And so by having these independent standards, the producers, they are able to plan out the pesticide use per year, and they actually have to submit their plan. And if needed, we will revise the plan and ask them to follow the revised plan. And we also have a process to make sure that they do follow the plans. So we do take into consideration realities that make some pesticides inevitable, but we make sure that we have management of pesticides to minimize the amount.
This was briefly mentioned earlier, but now I'd like to give more details. So we do have a national eco-friendly produce certification and labeling system. But we also have our own system for looking into the residual pesticide being detected. So we began our management in 2017. We have about 2,200 households participating. They would do inspection once every year for the national inspection, and we have our own self-inspection at Hansalim, which we conduct every year also. In 2017, we identified about 100 farms where residue was detected. In 2022, we saw another spike. And in 2022, because of the PLS system introduction, a lot of different detection cases were identified. As for the causes, well, non-point pollution would be the top cause, and then also residue in the water or residue in the soil and the water pollution would be some other causes. And we have about less than 5% of actual pesticide use by our producers. So these producers will sometimes just give up this certification system or labeling, or there were some mistakes committed by the other workers at the farm. You did hear about the pesticide residue detection issue in Korea in the earlier presentation. So we do have cases of cancellation of the national certificates when there's detection. So from 2004, we at Hansalim had asked our producers to receive national certification. So now if you receive cancellation, then our contract also becomes nulled with these producers. But the issue again with the national system is that there are pesticide detection sometimes that is beyond control. And so from a few years ago, we developed our participatory certification system in which all stakeholders, the producers and the consumers all participate. So the purpose of this participatory certification system is to ensure that the community find ways themselves to enhance production efficiency, and also we want to give the consumers an opportunity to participate in the inspection to enhance their understanding, which will lead to higher consumption. And so we are really encouraging the participation of all stakeholders, and we also look at the entire process of the cultivation during the inspections. So through these efforts, the organic farming which we had in mind, which would enliven the local community, economy, and also protect the environment. I mean, that was the very beginning vision of Hansalim. And so we hope to use this participatory certification system more in order to fulfill this vision that we had begun our movement with. So I'm showing you some photos of the participatory certification system. You will see that the consumers and the producers themselves directly participate in the inspections, and there's also a participatory committee that goes through certification deliberation. And so you will see a lot of different stakeholders participate to enhance their understanding about eco-friendly farming. And so we provide not just the certification mark, but also the QR code which shows information about the site of the production and the process by which this produce was developed and eventually sold to the consumer. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce to you our direct trading efforts or direct trading movement. We want to ensure that there is the least number of middlemen or mid-level levels between the consumers and the producers. So we're not just focusing on the distribution system. We want to ensure that the producers and consumers actually experience the fact that they are directly linked together. And we believe that is the essence of direct trading. So we have a lot of events. The May Festival, the Fall Harvest event, or visits to the production sites and to the logistics centers, and different meetings allow our producers and consumers to interact directly and get to know each other quite often. So Hansalim, the size of the business has continued to grow, and so it's become more difficult to stick to our principles to continue to communicate and understand ourselves better. And the times are changing, our culture is changing, as well as our members' perception. And so there is a lot of call for change from within Hansalim. And there's also the fact that we have a very strict production and shipment criteria, which makes it difficult for new producers to enter our system. And the receiving price of the producers is continuing to decline from 35% to 30%. And there's also criticism that there's too many meetings and communication channels, which is very consuming, and our decision-making process is very slow. However, every time we're faced with challenge, we go back to our founding vision and principle, which is to ensure that the producers take care of the health of the consumers, and the consumers take care of the livelihood of the producers. producers. So we're going to adhere to this principle and this vision as we continue on with our work in the future. We hope that the example of Hansa Lim has been helpful as you seek a positive way forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We did ask Hansa Lim for their presentation, and we asked them about their records and data because when we launched the Pesticide Atlas, the Korean version, we used statistics for the graphics. And it's very difficult to find the consumption of pesticides because all of the data was on the sale of pesticides. And so all of the data is mostly from pesticide companies. And so we were quite shocked to find that. Hansa Lim actually accumulated a lot of data, and you have shared that data, and so we wanted to have access to your data, and it was a great pleasure to listen to that presentation. We are behind schedule, but now we will go into Q&A. So this brings us to the end of all 4 presentations, and we will go into Q&A, including Reina, who is in Berlin. And so she is actually connected online, and I understand that sometimes the connection is not very good. Reina, are you there with us?
willkommen.
So we have heard 4 presentations in total, and I'm sure that you have many questions. Actually, we have received 4 questions in advance, so I would like to share those questions first. The first question was on the level of awareness about eco-friendly farming in Korea compared to Asian countries and countries around the world. I think much of this was answered through the presentations already. The second question was on whether pesticides should never be used or sometimes should it be used as appropriate, and what is the today and tomorrow of GMO. The third question is about farmers who farm without machinery, without pesticides, without fertilizers, who try to use their own seeds to farm. Are their lives sustainable? The fourth question was about the policy direction to reduce the use of pesticides. Who would like to go first?
아니요.
So the question was about the past, present, and future of GMO. It was a part of the second question. If we think about the present, future, and the past for GMO, I think we have to think about the question of pesticides first, because it depends on the range or the scope of pesticides that we have in mind, because there's also biological agents. What we are talking about today is chemical and synthetic pesticides, and we already know that chemical and synthetic pesticides impact the ecosystem of the earth. And so we have to move in the direction of reducing the use and not actually going in the direction of banning these chemical and synthetic pesticides. But in some cases, there are examples where pesticides are inevitable. Some of the farmers said they're not afraid of pests, they're not afraid of weeds, but what they are afraid of diseases in their plants. And they actually use some chemicals to get rid of those diseases, but then they are deemed to be non-organic because of the use. So what we see for the GMOs is that GMO actually is related to genetic editing and genetic scissors, and we see that all of these technologies were developed in pharmaceuticals. So for the pharmaceuticals, they can only profit if certain diseases happen for a certain person, but if this is actually used in agriculture, because everybody eats food around the world, then these genetic modification technologies can be used to benefit the companies from everyone around the world. And that is why they are moving in this direction. GMO is usually used to make sure that the plants have a tolerance for herbicides and pesticides because, for example, the glyphosate that we talk about, this actually is a herbicide that kills even the crops. But if GMO is used so that these plants do not die from this herbicide, then that means that they can use as much as glyphosate as they want. So for the pesticide-tolerant GMOs, we believe that the pesticide elements have been inserted into the GMOs so that there will be no need for pesticides, but HHP herbicides are used. But because they don't use pesticides, the companies are saying that it benefits the environment because it uses less pesticides. But if we talk to GMO farmers, they mentioned that with HHP, we have pests and weeds that are more tolerant for pesticides and herbicides, and we have new pests that are coming in. And so in the long term, it means that we are using more agrochemicals in altogether. Currently, all of the GMOs that we have in Korea are first generation GMOs, and so it's mostly tolerant more towards herbicides and pesticides. But there's also second generation GMOs. From 2017, they have added the so-called health-related functions, but currently it's not imported into Korea. In Korea, we only have first generation, but we are aware that about 20 of the second generation GMOs have been approved in the US, and they are expanding that around the world. So in conclusion, in Korea, we only have first generation GMOs, and so we don't have to be too overly worried about GMOs in Korea, but there are incidents in Korea related to these products. Mostly it's due to illegal use, and so I do believe that we are relatively safe in Korea up until now. So it sounds like we need a new GMO atlas.
예, 지금
So if there are any
9시인데요.
questions for Rina or any other presenters, please raise your hand and let us know. The first question goes to Rina. You mentioned in your pre-recorded presentation that the EU regulation against glyphosate will go into effect this year. And are you optimistic about the progress? And do you believe that definitely the regulations will go into effect this year? I hope that you can share the situation with us. Because in Korea, we have a very low self-sufficiency rate for some crops, such as wheat. We have a 99% reliance on imports, and so we are very concerned about glyphosate. And so could you share the current situation with us? I have a second question.
Thank you so much for this question. So there are two things, actually. On the one hand, there's the debate or the parliamentary process about the sustainable use of pesticides regulation at EU level. So this applies to all pesticides, like a 50% reduction of all chemical pesticides being used in the EU. And then there's the reapproval process for glyphosate, like as an active substance. So those are two different processes. But actually, at the moment, I'm not very optimistic. This is sad. But even after I recorded the input for this launch event today, there has been even more attack on this sustainable use regulation, because now pesticide lobby, farmers associations are also creating a new alliance with the conservative group in EU Parliament. So there is a lot of opposition against this law. And I also want to add, and glyphosate is, I cannot say if I'm, I don't really have an opinion if I'm too optimistic about glyphosate. It should really be, the approval should be revised, definitely. But I don't have any insights if this will happen at the moment. There was nothing leaked or anything so far. But I want to also reply to the GMO question, because this is highly relevant at EU level at the moment, also when it comes to pesticides, because at the moment at EU level, a proposal is being debated whether the use of second generation GMOs, so genome editing, which was mentioned before by the other speaker, should be legalized, or should be liberated, the use of them. So at the moment, this is sort of like a trade-off debate. So pesticide industry is trying to frame this liberation of second-generation GMO as this could be helpful to reduce the use of pesticides. This is sort of like the argument of the industry. However, we see that second-generation GMOs, if we look at the traits that are being developed, most of the traits are still herbicide tolerance. So this is the same logic as in the first-generation GMOs. But still, this is used as an argument to push for this second-generation GMOs. And I know that many farmers, especially organic farmers, are alarmed about the liberation, about this liberation, this possible liberation, because it could end up in contaminating organic farmers' fields. And of course, then they could not claim themselves as organic anymore. So this is a very, this is very urgent at the moment. So at the end, beginning of July, the Commission will decide whether second-generation GMOs will be liberated at European level. So at the moment, I'm not optimistic neither on sustainable use of pesticides, a reduction, nor on the GMO level at the moment.
Thank you. I am a farmer and I also do surveillance for multinational companies. I am Kim Jong-chul. I have two questions concerning the banning of paraquat. In Korea, it is banned, but we also see that for some Korean companies that have large plants in Indonesia, they are using paraquat. And so my question is concerning the export ban that you talked about in your pre-recorded presentation. Are there any regulations banning European companies from using banned substances outside of Europe? My second question is about the honeybees. Many people think about different reasons why honeybees are disappearing. And one of the reasons that we can see in Korea is that the local governments are providing support so that the farmers can use drones to spray agricultural chemicals. But because drones cannot carry a heavy load, a lot of the concentrated pesticides are used to be sprayed using drones, which leads to a higher level of residue, and that is then eaten by honeybees, and thus the disappearance of honeybees. Are there any regulations on the use of drones for these purposes in Europe?
Thank you so much for these questions. So regarding the export ban, what you just described is exactly what is happening like in Europe, and or this is exactly the logic that companies like Bayer and BASF or also Syngenta in Switzerland are producing chemicals that are not allowed for use in Europe and exporting them to other countries, whether that be in Africa or Latin America or Asia. And so far, there's no export ban. However, at international level, there's the so-called Rotterdam Convention, and there's a list of pesticides, of hazardous pesticides, an annex with this list. And these substances can only be traded globally if the importing country gives its consent. So this is why it's called the Prior Informed Consent Convention, the PIC Convention or Rotterdam. So this is the only regulation that exists so far, but if the importing country is okay with the importation of these hazardous substances, it is still legal. So there's no like binding prohibition for exporting hazardous pesticides from any country. So this is exactly where like the German national export ban or the French national export ban, but also the EU-wide export ban wants to like fill a gap. But I think also this is only one measure of implementing or of putting an end to these double standards. Obviously, I would really be in favor of a global ban of any highly hazardous pesticides, so the HHP, a phase out of highly hazardous pesticides. This is what, for example, Pesticide Action Network International has been working on for a long time. Okay, thank you so much. Now, the second part of the question was about the use of drones in agriculture to spray pesticides, correct? So in the European Union, drones are not allowed to be used for applying pesticides. Drones are only allowed to monitor the size of the field or also monitor soil health, soil quality, but not to spray pesticides. I think this is an important issue, and I do see, like, for example, in many other countries, let's say in Latin America, in many countries, pesticides are sprayed from the air, from airplanes, for example, in Ceará, this is a federal state in the northeast of Brazil, I just heard that the spraying of pesticides from airplanes is still prohibited. It was prohibited before, But for example, the spraying of pesticides from drones is not prohibited. So there's like a different legislation or a different evaluation because like the narrative of the industry is that when you use drones, you can apply pesticides more accurately, but still it would harm bees, I would say, as you said. So in the EU, so far, this is not allowed, but I'm curious to see how this will evolve in the future.
So in talking about the pesticide reduction policy, we heard earlier in the EU presentation that the EU has a set goal of reducing pesticide use by 50% by 2050. Unfortunately, in Korea, we don't have such a clear policy or standard in place with regards to reducing pesticide. In EU, I understand that they have set this goal of reducing pesticide use by 50%, and part of that effort would entail strengthening the organic agriculture industry. Unfortunately for Korea, we do have the goal of increasing the share of organic farming to 30% by 2050, but under that, we don't have any specific goal of reducing pesticide use. No such pesticide reduction goal is included in our net zero policy. Although there seems to be an overall decline in organic farming and environmental preservation farming practices. But in fact, if you look at the statistical figure closely, you will see that the number of farms that are trying to do environmentally friendly agriculture is actually increasing in Korea. And I believe that this stems from their basic philosophy that they have to participate in preserving the health of the land, of the earth. And so I think the increase in the number of organic farms is a result of this kind of a vision and philosophy. And what the Korean society overall should understand at the same time is that, of course, there may be cases when certification is required for this type of farming. However, we can also have at the same time a non-certified system of environmentally friendly produces and agricultural practices that take root in the country. The last statement I'd like to make has to do with the status of Korea in Asia in terms of our environmentally friendly agriculture. We were discussing briefly about the practices in Asia, but a unique feature of Korea is that from the beginning, we had both the producers and consumers come together to link up and cooperate together in order to grow the environmentally friendly agriculture together. So this is something different from the practices in other countries or regions where it was usually the producers who led the effort and the consumers simply followed on and bought the products that were produced. And of course, the government support policies were helpful in developing our eco-friendly agriculture industry also. But again, the unique feature of Korea is that from the beginning, the producers and the consumers collaborated together to allow Korea to hold this high status in environmentally friendly agriculture in the Asian region. Thank you so much. It's close to 5:30, so we will have to finish up with the Q&A session here. And now it's time for us to listen to the closing remarks. Again, I'd like to thank all of our presenters for your sharing of thought.
We would now like to invite Christian Backel to the stage, coming all the way from Turkey to the other side of Asia, to Seoul, to head up the Seoul office of HBS.
안녕하십니까? I'm sorry, this will be the only word I can utter in Korean today. I'm still at the very beginning. It's nonetheless my great pleasure to be here today. As you've just heard from my colleague Axel, this work is part of our work on East Asia that we have started a few years ago and that we hope to continue from this year on, exactly from Seoul here in Korea, not only covering Korea but also covering some neighboring countries. I'll be moving to this wonderful city next month. Of course, we will need some time to set up the office, to find suitable candidates who want to work with us, but also to find partners like Small is Beautiful, but hopefully also many others in Korean civil society, interested in the different topics that the Böll Foundation engages. And it's will be a very new chapter also for me. It was just mentioned, I'm currently in Turkey on a very different point in the world with very different challenges. But there is a beauty sometimes working for a green foundation, and that is, while greens are very different all over the world, there is some sort of a wider family feeling. And I'm very much looking forward to hopefully becoming, with the foundation, part of the already existing and very strong green family in Korea. Thank you very much.
I hope you will be able to enjoy
여기 어떤
networking
선생님이
opportunities
말씀하셨다는-
outside in the lobby, and we, in publishing our pesticide Atlas, we also came across the 1984 material published by the Catholic Association of Farmers, and we were quite surprised by the depth and the information that is included in that report. Please pick up a copy of the Pesticide Atlas outside in the lobby. Thank you very much.